It is my pleasure to introduce Harper Reed as our next speaker. I first became aware of Harper Reed when shortly after the 2012 election in November, an article popped up and it said, the title of it was, "When the Nerds Go Marching In." And I thought, well, that sounds pretty clever. Nerds go marching in. I no longer really qualify as a nerd because I've been distracted with other things. But I have the greatest of respect. So I started reading this story, and it is an extraordinary tale of transforming what you could think of as an industry if you want. But just as universities have become more digital and gone through change, and record industry and video and everything, political campaigns have been going through this tremendous change of greater and greater digitization. And the 2012 election was one of those where both teams were building out the technology architecture. You had the nerds trying to make it all work at the scale and under the pressure of a major campaign, and you had the political pros saying, that's not how we do that around here. So it wasn't only about building a big piece of software, but it was also very, very much about leading organizational change under pressure. And so I read the article, then had the good fortune, Harper Reed spoke at the Internet 2 TechX Exchange just about 18 months ago up in Indianapolis, and I said to Daphne, we really should try to get him here because he really has such great experience in technology, architecture, but more importantly, leading teams and leading organizational change. He's currently at PayPal and working with a acquisition they recently did called Modest. And with that, it's my pleasure to welcome to Bloomington, Indiana, Harper Reed.
So just dance, dance, dance.
Wow.
So just dance, dance.
Hello, everyone. I always like to make sure that works. Hello. So my name is Harper. One of the only reasons I like to come out and speak in front of audiences like this is because I need more Twitter followers. So this is kind of like an ill-gotten social media campaign. So please follow me on Twitter. And the main reason is I'd love to continue the dialogue and answer any questions that I can via my favorite social media medium. So today I'm going to talk about two things really, and you know, these are important things. One of them is about data. The other one is kind of about product design. I think that those are two of the most important things when anyone talks about technology, is how to use data and then how do you build products, because that's kind of what we all sort of do. But before I go through these two things, I want to talk about one of my favorite topics in the entire world, which is myself. How many people know who these folks are? Okay, good, good. How many people had an Apple IIc? Okay. How many people had a Commodore? I'm sorry about that. I obviously had an Apple IIc, and everyone knows who these folks are? Yeah? Does anyone know who the person in the middle is? Yeah, I thought so. No one does. Has anyone read this book? Really great book, kind of about history of computers, history of hacking, history of this kind of idea. You know, I bet a lot of the experiences they talk about here are things that happened here at IU. This idea of kind of using computers, using technology, trying to find out what is behind that kind of locked door. This idea of like sharing, openness, collaboration, all of these really important things that are about kind of being a hacker. I read this book when I was about 13. And it really changed everything. And I realized, for the most part, that kind of I identify as this idea of hacker. Do I have any hackers in the audience? No? Only 1, 2, 3, 4? I'm sure there are a lot more, but they're scared. What about any coders? I spent a lot of time as a programmer. That was kind of my main profession for many years, is just programming computers. Any programmers? Okay, good. So all of y'all are actually probably hackers, just not quite ready to identify that in a group of 1,000 people or whatever. How many people here know about Threadless? Anyone here heard of Threadless? Okay, good. So I joined Threadless around 2004. This is kind of a very fun experience for me. And one of the things about Threadless that's fascinating is that we accidentally invented crowdsourcing. And I say accidentally because we had no idea what we were doing. And we were at MIT, and at kind of an event like this, and one of us was giving a speech, and they said in their intro, here's Threadless, they invented crowdsourcing, and we were just like, crowd what? What are you talking about? Because for us, it was very simple. We were trying to make this into that. We weren't actually trying to change how work was done. But we did this with this kind of interesting thing of using the crowd and using with these very simple steps. But the steps are really simple. Like people like y'all would design a nice T-shirt. Everyone has a good T-shirt idea. You would design it. Then you'd submit it to Threadless. Then from there, we as a community, as a crowd, would score these T-shirts. And then cash money would fall from the ceiling into our pockets. And this worked out pretty well for everyone, mostly Threadless. And this is a fun kind of thing. I'm a big T-shirt fan, and I enjoyed this process quite a bit. It took a little while to realize kind of the impact that we had, and this was a really fun kind of project to be a part of, especially because it was a young startup. We had a lot of ideas, and I got in trouble for talking about revenue, so this will have to be a good demonstration. But the best part about this is because we used crowdsourcing, we actually did none of the hard work. We put that to the crowd to do all that good stuff, and that was really important. Our technology stack was very straightforward. This is a simple kind of thing, and it allowed us, like many things, to allow us to focus directly on the product, not on kind of the facilitation of the technology. Around 2009, I realized that I'd accomplished 100% of my goals, everything I'd set out to do, and so I did the thing that I really enjoy doing, which I hope that all of you will join me with today, which is I quit my job. Who's with me? Okay, we have a couple people and some hoops and hollering, so that's a good sign. Anyone? We can start a company or something, or maybe just hang out for the rest of the summer, a couple days here. And I went on this vision quest. The vision quest is an important part of something that I like to do. Does anyone here know what a vision quest is? Okay, good number. Okay, who doesn't? Okay, so I'll describe it. Basically, a vision quest is when you go into the desert, you do a lot of drugs, and you find your spirit animal. I did not do this. This is not what I did. I joined a venture capital firm for a little bit, which I think is similar. Maybe different outcomes. But this venture capital firm, the reason I joined that is because I really wanted to learn kind of what makes a company survive, what makes a company last, what makes a company work and be able to execute on very big ideas. And I didn't actually learn the answer for that, but this time period made me I call it like a palate cleanser. You got to learn a little bit about what companies do and kind of how to do things and how to do big things. And during this process, I met this guy, Michael Slaby, who was a CTO in 2008 for the Obama campaign. And Michael Slaby and I got to talking, and one thing kind of led to another, as it does, and then I became the CTO in 2012. And let's look at this transition real quick. I used to joke that the next CTO would be a homeless person. But yeah, this is my official campaign photo. Also, it was posted on Tumblr as part of this big kind of social media thing. And the question that always comes up about like this kind of like this thing of is basically why me? Obviously the first person to ask that was my mom, where she's like, why you? And I'm just like, come on, Mom, like, what do you mean why me? But you got to really think about and look at the difference between 2008 versus 2012, whereas in 2008, we had this kind of this identity of being a startup. And I don't know how many people have been involved in a campaign, Republican or Democrat, but that first campaign, you just don't know if you're going to survive. It's a game of survival. It's a game of resources. You don't know if you're going to make it 2 weeks or a month. And that's like many startups. How many people here have been involved with a startup? And especially early stage, you just don't know if it's going to survive. And so you're fighting. Every day you're fighting for survival. You're fighting to get that extra day, extra hour, extra 2 weeks. Whereas in 2012, we knew we were going to raise like $1.3 billion or whatever it was. We knew we were going to do this really big kind of project. We knew we had to invest very heavily in technology and IT. And so, of course, they basically looked for someone that kind of represented that enterprise world, and me being a great representative of enterprise software, was the person they chose. And so I was describing this idea to my partner, who is Japanese, and so she's like talking about this idea of this. I have no idea what that says. But she said it's called mochi wa mochi ya. And this is a really interesting kind of Japanese phrase, which basically means if you're looking for rice cakes, you go directly to the rice cake store. You don't actually go to like the gas station to buy rice cakes. And so if you take this and put it into kind of an American context, if you're looking for donuts, you don't buy the gas station donuts, you buy the donuts at the donut store. They're just better donuts. So when you think about this in regards to technology, this is the first time in politics, in American politics, that we went and got engineers. Before that, what it was is we just hired anyone that was in front of us and said, okay, you're now the engineer. And they're like, what? And you're like, yeah, just program that computer. And the person would go over there and just kind of bang on it, and eventually it would work. But this time, in 2012, we decided to hire as many engineers as we could to do all of this really important work that we did. One of the teams that I worked with had about 40 people. The interesting thing about that, well, besides the fact they're from all these companies, obviously that's the most important one, but the interesting thing about that is that it was 10 times the number of engineers that we had in 2008. And so if you think about this order of magnitude, I think actually, I don't know the exact numbers, but I bet it's the same with the new campaigns that are happening now, where the number of technologists on the campaign is just added an extra 0. It's pretty exciting. So we started from exactly 0, from nothing. When I walked in, I stepped into the campaign, and I was like, great, I'm here. There was nothing. And I was like, where's all this stuff from 2008? And they were just like, I don't know. And I was like, what do you mean you don't know? Like, this 2008 was known as this big technology solution, and they were just like, I have no idea. And so I guess they burnt it in some victory pyre or something. I remember, it was kind of a funny thing, but we had about 18 months, and 18 months seems like forever. I think about right now, 18 months in the future, and I have no idea. But when I look back at it, it's actually about a week. And so because of this time period being so short, we had to focus on pretty much just execution. That was the only thing we could do. This is a cake. This was made by one of our DevOps people. He brought it in. And the funny thing about this cake is, at this point, we're kind of, it's about probably 2 weeks before Election Day, and we're all very superstitious. I don't know if anyone here has been involved with some really big launch, where you're just like, please just work. And you're just ready for it to work. So he brings in this cake, sets it down, and is like, hey, everyone, I brought cake. And everyone like runs, because they're all, for some reason, we're all really into cake at this point in time. We run up, we get to it, and it's like a magnet. Everyone's like, oh, no, repelled immediately from it. Because what if we eat the don't fuck it up cake and then fuck it up? Like, we have to be careful here. You can't, we can't mess with this idea. So they waited, and then they ate after we won, which is way sketchier. It's like, at that point, it's like a 3-week-old cake. So yeah, anyway, we built this big platform, and this is not a crazy idea, especially when you think circa 2012. How would you build something that would allow us to focus on execution? We called this platform Narwhal, which was kind of an ill-chosen name. The idea was very simple. We wanted something that allowed us to talk. Like, after a hard day's work, you go to the bar and have a drink with some of your coworkers, and you want to be able to talk about what you're working on without saying, oh, how's the work going on the people database that tracks every American? You don't want to say that. You want to say, like, how's Narwhal going? Well, it turns out that when you name something Narwhal, everyone from the political reporters are like, what's Narwhal? So it totally backfired, because then it was this big secret. So if you look at press from that era, everyone's just like the Obama campaign and their mystical narwhal. And one of the funny things that I don't think I've ever actually said this. One time I remember talking to the campaign manager, Jim Messina, who you'll see in a second, and trying to convince him that narwhals weren't real. Because I really wanted him to go in front of an audience like this and do this big and say the mystical creature of the narwhal. And then have someone be like, no, that's a real thing. Anyway, actually, this is Jim Messina as a narwhal. The campaign was really, really, really stressful. This was one of the most stressful things I've ever done. A very different stress. And so every time we'd have meetings, like every Thursday we'd have like a checkup meeting where we'd talk about all of the various technology IT projects that we had, and we just make sure that we're still on track. This was a lot about getting trust, making sure people were kind of happy with the work we were doing. And really, this is my favorite one. This is so weird. And a lot of this was just about kind of, for me, it was how do we have a little bit more fun? Because I think that's why we're here, right, to have fun. And so we would put these were the last slides, and they would just say that, and they'd have a little thought bubble, and it'd say questions. And every time I did a presentation, we'd have one of these photoshopped things. And so the question was always like, what's wrong with you? I was always like, I don't know. So anyway, Narwhal. So Narwhal was this kind of concept, this big idea, this very interesting idea that we could make an API as our foundation for everything. That this API could connect everything and give us the freedom to really focus on the products that we are making. And these products are products that at this point are kind of the default for a campaign, regardless of kind of which political flavor you're focused on. They're call tools for voter contact. We had a product called Dashboard, which is kind of business process management, a lot of geo-local voting tools. We had a lot of mobile apps. At this point, we had Android and iOS mobile apps, but one of the most important things, and this is something that I think probably applies to y'all, is 100% of our apps, internal or external, were responsive. Because when you have a staff of thousands, or in our case, millions, you never know what device they have. You may have a very good policy for devices, but with Shadow IT or bring your own devices, you just don't know what device they have. And so making sure that it's responsive and kind of works with every device is really important. So we invested very heavily in responsive design. Our contribution apps were really fun. And one of the secrets there is that probably had the smallest team of any of our products, and I think they made $650 million via email, so that was a pretty good ROI. Social media is boring. Does anyone here like social media? It's boring. Or one person was like, I do. Big data. Big data is exciting. Maybe? Yeah? Woo! So one of our biggest innovations was big data, but before we get into that, I'm going to have a little intervention about big data. So here's the thing. Big data is bullshit. And I'll tell you why. The reason is because of the big. The big data part, when people say big data, that was like super cool and really relevant in like 2006. Because then it was like, it was real hard to store stuff. You're like, I have to store all this stuff. And people were like, wow, that's hard. And then in 2008, they were like, here's how you do it. And then in 2009, they're like, here's how you do it for free. So when I think about big data, I just think about marketing. Like this is like, Greenplum or Oracle. They want you to be scared. They want you to be like, you can't solve this problem. It's impossible without us. But with us, you can, only if you pay us millions of dollars. But the thing is data is storage is solved. We've done this problem. We've solved this problem. Hard drives are cheap. Some of the database sizes that we were seeing in 2006 are now MP3 players that you can buy for like $35 from China. And so when you have like a terabyte hard drive in your pocket to store your music, and and we're talking about databases that were that big, that were big data. Like when we think about the problems today are actually more around questions and answers. We're not actually talking about storage any longer. We're talking about how do we find insights. And so when I think about big data, I actually replace the data part with answers. And that's really what I want to talk about. When someone has a conversation about big data, I always want to reflect back and say, actually, no, I don't care about the data. I care how are we going to get that answer. That's the end of the intervention. I should be on that show. Isn't there an intervention show? What a boring intervention. It'd be kind of funny, though. Everyone would be like, what are you talking about? So anyway, one of our biggest innovations was data, right? Everything we did was data-driven. And the media loved this. They were like, ooh, data. And so if you do this query real quick on Google, Obama campaign data. Oh, yeah, that's boring. Let's make it really exciting. Let's go ahead and throw in my favorite term here, micro-targeting. Does anyone know what micro-targeting is? Okay, a few people. I'll talk a little bit through this. But let's zoom in on that first. Enhance. Okay. I have no idea why it says that. But I do know that this is my favorite picture on the internet. This is a horse holding a cat on a boat. Who knew? Right? This is great. I just love this photo. So anyway, micro-targeting is exciting. That's basically what it says. This is basically saying, we're really excited about micro-targeting. So excited, we're going to use fake words to describe it. But it's actually pretty simple. The first thing is that campaigns and businesses have a lot of success with emails. Email is one of my favorite mediums in the world. Email, so much email is sent. And yet, when was email invented? Does anyone remember? I think it was in like 1000, year 1000. It's old, right? Email is old. And it still works, and it works really well. I'm sure some of you are doing email right now. It's awesome. But the thing is we will constantly send email. Businesses will constantly send email. This tweet was sent in 2008. And I think that what we demonstrated is that more emails gets more money. And you can't, there was a famous joke, I think, where the president was on Jon Stewart or something, and Jon Stewart said, "How do I unsubscribe?" And they were just like, "You can't." But it's not that you can't unsubscribe. You actually can. It's just that it works so well. People unsubscribe, and then they give more money, and then they're resubscribed because they just forget. So anyway, we did a lot of fun stuff with email. This is one of my favorite experiments we did. It was very good. So here's an email that I received in probably right before Election Day. The key here is right there, that $56. So the first thing is as someone who likes numbers, I don't know why that is out of order. I'm like, why wouldn't that be under the 35 or after the 50 or whatever? This is out of order. But the key is we did some math, some analytics. We looked at all my previous donations. We looked at all the work that I had done on the campaign, and we had this algorithm that said, how much money is Harper liable to give? How much money will not be too uncomfortable, too hard for Harper to give, but just enough that our math, our analytics will say he will click this button. So I open this email, and I'm just like, open the email, and I'm like, oh my God, $56, fuck yeah. Right? I click it. Now here's the big innovation. The first innovation was that $56 was targeted towards me. The second innovation was when I clicked that button, when I clicked that link right there, that $56, that it instantly took the money from my bank account. It did not ask permission. Because I'd previously said, yeah, go ahead and do that. This was called Quick Donate. Because here's the thing, oftentimes when we're building kind of experiences with products, I'll talk about it in a little bit, we always ask permission. But we don't have to ask permission because people expect this. What it says right there, if you click this, you're gonna, you'll donate this money. So when you click that, you're not gonna be surprised when you donate the money. This is a huge innovation. That raised us about $250 million. Just that link there. Another thing we did is we went ahead and we added a Facebook login in front of it. This worked really well because what we did is we took all of your Facebook data, sucked it down, and we did a lot of neat analytics on this to find out who your best friend was. There's a small opportunity of this being really creepy. I remember when we were testing this, you're sitting there and you're running through the product and you just connect your Facebook and it lists out like your 10 top friends. And it's weird that you can quantify that with analytics. But what we would do is we'd go through and, everyone, who here is on Facebook? Okay, who here isn't on Facebook? That's really how you get okay, you guys are weirdos. But all the people on Facebook, you know how you have those friends oftentimes from a long time ago who somehow have the time to like every status update? And you're just like, what are you doing? How are you liking every single status update? And then so those people, we would take all those people together and we put them in a kind of a bucket. And then you have the friends that have commented. Then you have the friends that you've interacted with where you've liked their status updates. Start circling this out and try and get a smaller and smaller audience. And then there are the people that you are tagged in photos with. You're tagged in geolocations with. And suddenly this audience gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And then we can start to define which of this smaller group, maybe it started out as 200 people, now it's 5 people. Which of this group are you the influencer of? And then we send an email like this to me, the influencer, and say, hey, Harper, why don't you go ahead and give John a call? John lives in North Carolina. This is a battleground state. This is really important that you reach out to him because you are the influencer of him. So what we did is we looked at this Facebook data, and we synthesized it into another medium. And so this is where social media is exciting, is how we take the social media, and we don't necessarily play in that realm. We take that and synthesize it into another place. This is really fun. We also did a lot with SMS, and SMS is always very powerful because SMS has such a high open rate. I was very worried about SMS. I thought it was going to work out kind of like this, where it just wasn't going to work out very well. But I'm actually very positive, that it did work, and it was really cool. We used it on New Year's. New Year's, it made a lot of money, but I'm pretty sure this is how it kind of actually was. And then that was a fun time. But email was the key. And email, we always had multivariate testing, a lot of A/B testing on subject lines. And we have obviously a very large email list, so this allowed us to do some fun testing. But one of my favorite stories, well, first of all, we made about $640 million just on email, which is a boatload of dollars. One time I was kind of telling this story to some high school kids, and one of the kids raised his hand right in the middle and was like, "Did you see it?" And I was like, "See what? What are you talking about?" And he's like, "The money. Were you able to go into the room with all the money?" I don't think that he had a real good handle on how money worked. But so one of my favorite stories about this was we were doing all this testing, and there's this idea that you have this brand that is that cannot change. And if you think about a brand like this, one of the brands that I think is probably one of the biggest in the U.S. is this idea of the president, right? This is a person, who is presidential. That's going to sound silly, right? Obviously, they're presidential. But one of the things that the president doesn't say is, "Hey." And so when the president doesn't say, "Hey," it's very hard to convince people to say, "Oh yeah, the president says, hey." It's too casual. I don't know what the president would say, like "salutations," or something like that. But the thing is what we did is we did this test where we had a very simple subject line where the president said, "Hey." And we saw, will this work? And our email team is this amazing, amazing team, and they did this test. And the subject line that said, "Hey," made a boatload of money. From that point on, the president's brand was presidential and also said, "Hey." We were able to guide the brand around this kind of hurdle, and we made a lot of money because of that. That was really exciting. You can guide your brand with some very simple testing. All this stuff was great. It raised a lot of money. It helped us with content distribution, but the most important thing, obviously, was voter contact. And all this stuff combined allowed us once again to focus on what solves a problem easily. Since failure was not an option, we really needed to invest aggressively in user experience. Anyone here a user experience person? Okay, it's typical. There's like 2. We'll talk about that in a second. I'm going to have another intervention. I have to go back and do my slides real quick. But we invested aggressively in testing. Testing was really, really important. And the cool thing about the campaign is they have this really nice identity of testing. And so we practice failure constantly, this idea of how do we test to make sure we understand exactly what we're doing and how we do it. And the campaign having this strong identity of testing, of practicing failure, mock election days, etc. They had this, we did this constantly from the beginning to the end, constantly testing to see how things worked. And obviously on election day, things were pretty chill. No more changes. We couldn't mess with anything. This is an actual Post-it note that I found on a wall on election day. Walked in and I was like, okay, I'll calm down. I learned the definition of the word frenetic. That's a good word. But it was, for the most part, it was pretty chill. We just kind of watched technology and hope it didn't burn down, and luckily it did not. And thankfully we won. And thanks for your support during that time. I know that Indiana was a good state for that. But that was on to my next vision quest. Once again, no drugs, no spirit animals. This time I did something slightly different. We decided to start a company called Modest. I try and name everything after myself. Modest, we had this very simple goal. This was a simple goal. We wanted to, think about our past. Over the last 15 years, we spent all of our time working within e-commerce in one way or another, whether it was selling T-shirts. My co-founder, Dylan, worked at Crate and Barrel, building a lot of back-end software. I just built a lot of back-end software. Most of the software we built was on the back. We had never really focused on the front, on the user. And we decided, how do we flip this a little bit? How do we go, and rather than focusing on the back-end software, which is still important, you still have to have a good solution there, how do we focus on the front? How do we focus on that experience that the user has? How do we make sure that while we're focusing directly on that user, that we can create this really wonderful experience that's better for commerce? Something that allows the user to have a quicker experience, something that's much friendlier, but more importantly, mobile. Because mobile is the world we live in. And I remember in 2013, I was pitching a VC, and I said, the future is mobile. He was like, the future is not mobile. Right now is mobile. If we think the future is mobile, we've already failed. Because right now, mobile is the device that all of us have all of the time. And that was 2013. That was a long time ago. And this is very exciting, and it worked out pretty well. We made this amazing product, but we have this very great transition, which I'm really interested in cheat codes. Does anyone remember the Game Genie? I was a big cheater. If there's maybe it's because I'm really bad at video games. I've just never been good at video games. So every time I play a video game, I'm like, how do I get ahead? Well, I found a really good startup cheat code. It's basically to sell your company to PayPal. You get a lot of customers real quick. That's a good one. If anyone has a startup, that's a great way to get ahead. Works fast. So we sold our company to PayPal. This is really exciting. The product relaunches PayPal Commerce in January, and we've been working through that ever since, kind of the same ideas. But that's not what I'm here to talk about today. That was just my intro. Thanks. So this brings us to what we're talking about today. The one thing I want to say is this is important. Your mileage may vary. This is kind of the advice that we've created, but advice, everyone knows what advice is like. It never works out. So the first advice I have is about politics. I'm guessing that this is not a very political organization. I mean, I know that education is never political, and that everyone just gets along by default, and there's not competitive or anything, right? So I was talking to a friend of mine, and actually I should say this differently. Politics is hard, right? But I'm not talking about big P politics. I'm talking about that little p, that little tiny politics, the politics that's just person to person. And I was talking to a friend of mine, this guy, John Maeda. Does anyone know who this is? So, he's a pretty famous designer, actually just joined WordPress, runs a great blog. The URL is great. I think it's design.blog. That's a good URL. But he was at RISD. I think he was the president of RISD. And he joined RISD, and he'd had a hell of a time. Like, people were not interested in him being the president. And so he, during the midst of this, was right, I think, 2011. And he comes and visits the Obama campaign. And he just kind of runs in. He's kind of speaking of frenetic, he's a frenetic individual. Runs into my office and says, like, Harper, I bet you're dealing a lot with politics. And at this time I was. There was a lot of politics. There was a lot of trust issues. There's a lot of people that were just, like, not really thinking that we were serving them. And it was weird because we were, they just didn't think we were. And so how do we solve that? And so he gave me this advice that has kind of changed everything. This is this advice of how do you quantify politics? How do you quantify these relationships? And then how do you do something about it? And his advice was very simple. It was this: you have to manage by your outbox, not your inbox. Often when we have a frustrating work situation, what we're thinking about is very specifically, why hasn't that person reached out to me? We think that. But actually, if we reverse this, it usually works out perfectly. If we start sending that email out, instead of us thinking, why hasn't that person reached out to us, we instead reach out to them. And so I started thinking about this, and a week goes by, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to try it. So I try it. There's a person I have a somewhat adversarial relationship with, something that's a little frustrating. It's okay, but it's not quite great. And I send them an email, and it's like preemptively nothing, just like, hey, what's going on? Here's the status. Hope everything's great. Here's the status on this project we're working on together. And his response was really telling. His response wasn't about the project. It wasn't about the update. It was purely about the email. He said, thanks for emailing me. And I realized that what that meant is that he was expecting this, but couldn't figure out how to vocalize his needs, couldn't figure out exactly how to tell me that's what he was expecting. And once I did that, it kind of opened this door and started paving this way for us to have a better relationship. And so from then on, I started thinking, okay, how do I email out? How do I make sure I'm outbound rather than inbound? And everything worked a little bit better. And I have to say, I think this kind of saved my career at the campaign because it helped pave the way for some better politics. But obviously, hopefully, that may not work for, you might have to have the knife fight. That's typical. But we'll see. So let's get into the real presentation here, effective data usage. Data is one of my favorite things, but I want to tell you a little bit about how we think about data and our top rules for effective data. And so let's jump right in. The first one here is pretty simple, which is don't fall prey to the marketing hype. We talked about this already, right? This idea of big data. And the thing about big data is obviously that it's bullshit, but also data is the key, right? That's why we're here. That's what we're excited about. And so since storage is solved, how do we focus on those questions and answers, right? But the thing is, it's easy. We already have a lot of the tools to focus on that. We have the tools to solve these problems. One of my favorite tools is this one. Does everyone know this tool? This is a great tool, right? This is Excel, obviously. So that's my first kind of rule. Just use Excel. You don't have to do a bunch of crazy stuff. If you want to do crazy stuff, throw some OLAP cubes on that or whatever. But use Excel. And if you think about Excel, it's the widest distributed IDE in the world. Everyone uses it. My favorite thing, how many people here use Excel? Okay, put your hands down if you're not a programmer. Okay, how many people here use if statements in Excel? You're all programmers. I tell this to my partner all the time, and I'm like, you're a programmer. And she's like, I am not a programmer. And I'm just like, do you use if statements? And she's like, all the time. And I'm like, me too. Together forever. The thing about Excel is obviously this is not going to work for your giant, billion-row databases and all this other stuff that's really hard. But for the most part, the modeling that we need to do, we can just use Excel and it just works. And you can replace Excel for the same kind of tool, whether it's Google Docs or whether it's something like that. But it just works, and that's the thing that's important. Another thing is, very simply, think about conversion. This is something that we often forget about, this idea of conversion. When I do a lot of work in e-commerce, and so simply what we're trying to do is get the user to convert, and what that means is buy something. But I actually think we can think about this in many, many ways, and so here's an example of what I mean by this. On the campaign and then also at a few companies, you may notice that when you put a video on a page, your conversion goes way down. So for instance, if you're trying to sell something, you have a buy button there, you put a video on that page, less people are going to click on that buy button. That's something that we've learned over the years. It's pretty well documented. But here's what I mean by thinking about conversion. That's not the interesting thing. Put a video on your unsubscribe page because you don't want conversion there. So you want conversion to go down on that. But if you don't think about conversion, you're not going to think about that kind of trick. You always have to think, what are we trying to do here? On your unsubscribe page, you're trying to stop people from unsubscribing. Put a YouTube link there. That way, 5 minutes later, you're looking at videos of monster trucks and helicopters crashing, and you're having a great time. And you forget to unsubscribe, right? This is a great example of understanding what conversion means. And then it also leads you to this conversation with, about change. But this idea of how do you change and why do you change? I think that change must be defensible, but to do that, we have to understand data and we have to trust the data. But data is tricky. I remember my first interaction with an MBA. Anyone here an MBA? Okay, that's weird. Only two? Anyway, my first interaction with an MBA, they were like, let me show you a trick. And they showed me two models using the same data that were completely opposite. And I was like, how do you do that? And they were like, models can show you anything. And so you have to also be skeptical of the data, right? You have to make sure that the data is both your friend and your enemy. And has anyone seen this movie? Right, this is a great movie. This is the best movie about multivariate testing. This is amazing. Like, he basically just goes through and does A/B tests for years. And there's a great article on the internet you can find about how long he theoretically has been in this universe. And it's something like 1,000 years. That's a long time. So really, the key here is just, how do you repeat all of those tests? How do you do that over and over and over again? How do you iterate? How do you make sure it works? Actually, there's two quotations. These are my favorite quotations about data. The first one is from my former boss, Jim Messina. He basically said, the first time I meet him, actually, the first thing he said to me was, don't fuck it up, which is why that was on the cake, and I was like, oh, okay. The second thing he said to me, though, is this one, which is, if there isn't a metric, it doesn't exist. This was a simple idea. This also helps kind of debug any workplace argument. When someone says, hey, I think we should go this way, someone else says, I think we should go this way, just measure the numbers. And if they're like, I don't have the numbers, pretty easy argument. Because if there's not a metric, there's nothing to measure. If there's nothing to measure, what are we trying to do? We just don't have anything. And then you start to change the conversation. How do we get the numbers to prove what we're trying to do? And that goes back to the testing. And so you can see how this is a loop, a really important loop. The second one here is a really good one too, which is, if it moves, you should graph it. And so you can imagine you have this number that's jumping around. Graph it, see what you see. That will let you understand what this data is. And once again, you can easily use Excel for that. Track all the data is another thing that I used to say a lot. How do we track all of the data? Well, the problem here is that actually, we need to track enough data, not all of the data. And the reason why is this. Just because storage is solved, every single data point is a person. Oftentimes, when we look at that data point, at the end of that data point is a person. And so we just need to acknowledge, how are we treating those people? How would we want to be treated in that situation? Just because we can store every single data point doesn't necessarily mean we can. Because there's this thing that happens, right? One, data can be really creepy. Does everyone know the Target story? Okay, this is my favorite story. How many people don't know the Target story? Okay, good, enough to tell it. So Target had this thing where they had this really neat modeling program, and they did all this neat analytics, and the result of this analytics results in this mailer. And they sent the mailer out to all these people, and one of the mailers happened to arrive in the mailbox addressed to a 13-year-old young woman. And the father obviously picks up the mail, looks at the mailer, and the mailer's like, oh my gosh, you're pregnant. Here, come buy some pregnancy stuff. And the father is like, WTF? My daughter is 13 and not pregnant. This is crazy. So he goes to Target, he yells at the manager, this is inappropriate, you shouldn't be sending these things, like all this stuff. And the manager's like, I'm very sorry. A couple weeks go by, manager calls, follows up as a good customer service person would, and says, I'm sorry for that. Have the mailing stopped? And the father says, I need to apologize, actually. My daughter was pregnant. So Target, the problem here was, Target had this great model that basically was able to tell, based on purchasing habits, whether someone was pregnant. Based on unscented lotions, based on vitamins, based on all these things. That's insane. But the lesson here is not, you shouldn't have that model. The lesson is, you shouldn't have that model be on display in your marketing material. You should hide it. Not hide it like it's a secret, but make it non-obvious. So I'm guessing now probably what Target does is they send you the same mailer, but instead of like, you're pregnant, it's like, summer grilling, hot dogs, and over in the corner it's like, vitamins. Right? And so that's the thing that you do. You don't want your kind of creative, or you want your creative to kind of mask that model. But then the second thing is this idea of something that's very fashionable right now, data breaches. Have you guys had that fun? That's a good one, right? Well, the thing about data breaches is they just keep happening constantly. There's a really great website, Have I Been Pawned, which you can enter your email address, and you can just tell all the times that your accounts have been compromised. And you can get updates. I got one this morning. Really, every time I'm like, woo, yay, hacked. But the thing is that security is important, but the key here is that it's actually your responsibility. This is the difference that I think we currently have, is that right now we're like, the consumer should have had a better password. That's how they not get hacked. Well, yeah, but then they're not the ones getting hacked. We're the ones getting hacked. We're the ones that are losing all that data. That's why you need to think about every data point as a person. Because when you track all of the data and you keep all of the data, and the next thing we know is we accidentally leak it all out, like that can be really impactful, but not in a good way. But finally, the most important thing is, I'm just going to go back to that same thing I said in the beginning. Focus on the question and get the answer. That's the most important thing we have. And, this is pretty easy. Obviously, data can be our friend. Isn't that the biggest data you've ever seen? That's the only reason I do this presentation, right? For that slide, and then everyone in the audience just going like. Okay, so let's move on to the second thing, the future of product design. I always mix these two things because I often think when we're thinking about data, we're thinking about our IT systems, we're thinking about that. We're not thinking about the user. And I think product design is all about the user. And so once again, here's kind of our rules for this. The first one is, how do we think about speed? And oftentimes when we think about speed, we're talking about latency. We're talking about, man, our servers are fast, or our network is really fast. But actually, I'm talking about something different. This idea of, how do you allow the consumer to get what they want faster? How do you follow intent? Because oftentimes, if you think about e-commerce, when I go and I just bought some sheets on the internet, and you go to this website, and I'm like, I want to buy some sheets. And there's like 4,000 sheets. I don't care. I just want there to be a big button that says, click here and we'll send them to you. And I click there and I want it to arrive at my house. In fact, if I had my way, I wouldn't even click the button. I'd just look at the computer. The sheets would just arrive. And I think actually Amazon should launch that, right? Where you're just like, yep, stuff arrived. It should be like direct mail for products. There's the startup we'll do after y'all quit. So how do you follow intent? Well, following intent can be simple, but simplicity is really hard. So I have a very simple rule about simplicity. Don't be clever. Anyone here clever? Okay, so my rule on clever, anyone that raises their hand there will die before the rest of us. because no one who is clever ever survives. Here's a good example of why clever is bad. Taxes are going to come up, or you just paid your state taxes probably. Taxes are going to come up in April. Let's say your tax accountant is like, okay, I have a really clever idea. Are you gonna stick around for that tax accountant? No, you're gonna get out of there. And we're like, no clever ideas. But yet in IT, in technology, clever ideas is this thing that often powers us because it feels good, because we feel smart. We're like, yeah, I got a clever idea. But you know who always is the one that's punished by that is the user. Every time we have a clever idea, the user is screwed over. And so how we do this, we can still be a little bit clever. We can still focus on these things that as engineers make us feel good, or as administrators make us feel good. But we have to make sure we're focusing on user experience. And once again, how many user experience people are here? Okay, so there's 5, 6, maybe a few over there. There's 6 people in this room who talk to the users. Isn't that weird? All of us should be talking to the users. All of us should be user experience people. The next time someone says, do you have user experience people on your staff? The answer should be like, well, we all are, but we have a couple who are directly focused on it. Because here's the thing, user experience people are oftentimes put in a corner. They're abused more than product managers, which is a lot. And they're oftentimes ignored because they bring up these issues that are like the users, oh my gosh, they said this thing and they want this thing because this thing doesn't work, and we're like, oh, how terrible. But it's like our job is literally to build products for the users, and yet we have an adversarial relationship with them. So how do we solve that? Because the key here is user experience allows for you to have the difference between functional and usable. We can all do functional, that's easy. How do you make these experiences personal? How do you make them very easy, very personal? We talk a lot about signal-to-noise ratio. How do you make it so the consumer can find the things they care about? Going back to that idea of intent. And I think you can do this in a kind of a simple way by training the users. And one thing you could do, like we do a lot of coach marks, a lot of education, a lot of, walking people through that. I think there's a lot there. But then there's this idea of an experience. How do you make this delightful experience? If we go on the internet and we look at the new app that's very fancy in the App Store, they always talk about it's very delightful. I have no idea what that means. But I do know this idea that we talk about, which is like consumer serendipity. Once again, I barely know what that means. But let's kind of break this down a little bit. You can enhance serendipity, but what is serendipity? There's this algorithm here for luck that you'd see in a dentist office. And it's pretty simple, right? When you mix opportunity and preparation, that's when luck happens. This kind of idea. But serendipity is very similar. And so how do you do this? You create opportunity for the consumer. You manufacture opportunities for them. So if you know that I just want to buy some bed sheets, then send me an email that says, if you click here, we'll just send them to you. I already know your address. Create those opportunities. Don't be afraid to push that limit a little bit. But the final kind of product design or the final kind of advice that I have for you, regardless of what we're working on, is this idea of repetition. And for this, I'm going to call to my favorite hip-hop artist, Kanye West. Anyone here like Kanye West? Nobody here. This is my favorite part. This guy's like, yes, I love Kanye West. But my favorite part about doing this is I get up here on these stages and I say, anyone here like Kanye West? And everyone's like, no. I don't know what he did. People do not like him. But the thing about Kanye West is, one of the things about Kanye West is he says crazy stuff all the time. He seems to do crazy stuff. One of the things he said, I'm always like, okay, here's a new Kanye West interview. I'm going to read it because I'm going to kind of giggle to myself and laugh at how crazy Kanye West is. But he starts out this interview and he says, innovation gets too much credit. And I was like, wait a minute, that's not too crazy. Tell me more, Kanye. And he says, there's no money in innovation. And oftentimes in this culture of building products, of using data, of building these systems that we're all responsible for, we oftentimes are called to be innovative, to kind of have this idea of innovation. We talk about a culture of innovation oftentimes. And he's saying the right thing here. There's no money in innovation. Then he goes on and he says, the money is in repetition. And we think about survival of IT products. We think about survival of technology. It's all about repetition because innovation doesn't actually matter. You think of the great examples of things that were very innovative but didn't matter. Betamax. The local ride-sharing app. All these things that were innovative, they were better. They were the best technology, they were a better solution, but it doesn't matter because Innovation doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is repetition. And so you can be innovative, but if you don't have repetition, you have nothing. It's that tree that falls in the forest. No one sees it, no one hears it, no one will remember it. But if you have repetition, that's when everything works. And so my plan is always, how do we test things, as we talked about before? How do we repeat that test over and over again? And how do you push that out and weaponize it to make sure it works? Well, thank you very much. That's all I got for today. Hopefully it was helpful. And I think we have some time for some questions. And remember, vote for Harper.
Thank you. Come on over and have a seat. We've got about 10 minutes for some questions and answers with Harper, and you can tweet those to Statewide IT, and they'll magically, through the internet thing, get up here to me, and we'll pick some of those to talk about. So Harper, the first thing I noticed in meeting you is that we both have similar taste in fashion. We both wear dark clothes.
Yep.
And I was just curious if we shop at the same place, do you think?
Yeah, we probably do.
Possibly
yeah,
so.
Probably do. I'm trying to wear more black, to be honest. I decided a while back that I wanted to fit in Berlin, which that's a weird goal, but that's kind of a new goal.
Berlin's a very cool place.
It is.
So in the article, The Nerds Go Marching In, one of the things that, if I recall, the statement was that your team came in and you changed how politics work, how political campaigns work. Because if you think about where was Facebook, where was Twitter, where was social media, what did we have in data in 2004, it was a huge jump to the 2008 campaign that preceded you. And from 2008 to 2012, I think it said Facebook grew like by an order of magnitude during that time. But one of the things in the article that I thought was quite interesting, it said working in the depths and the pressure of a political campaign changed the technologists a bit too. What did you learn?
I think the biggest thing that I learned, which is strange because I should have just put it on the screen. The biggest thing I learned was probably that it actually has nothing to do with technology. You're not there for technology. Oftentimes as technologists, we have this very ego-based idea. You hear this all the time. How many of you interact with programmers? Okay, I'm going to replay a dialogue that programmers say. I will fix this for you. I have the solution. I am the only person that can save you. The thing about us programmers is we often are programmers because we think that we are the only person that can do this. It's this kind of ego-based job. Like there's always an information disparity. Like I'm the only one that can solve this problem for you. Well, first of all, that's not true. There are a lot of people that could. But second of all, we're actually, that's not collaborative. That's not a fun interaction. You know, that's an interaction of not empowerment. It should be like, we can solve this together. And one of the things that the campaign really showed us is two things. One, technology does not matter. As important as I think I am, it does not matter. Like we would have won in 2012 with or without technology. We couldn't have taken that technology and transplanted it to Romney's team, and Romney would not have been ahead. We didn't win because of technology. Now, the only caveat there is you can definitely lose because of technology. So that's where it's a little complicated. That's where the investment is important, and that's why it's so important to not have this be an I can solve it, to have it be a we can solve it. Because the we and the collaboration is how we're successful. If we use I, that's not success. That's ego.
I think that's one of the most interesting things to me. As I mentioned earlier, you watch organizations evolve, and it's people and the skills that they have. It's the environment they're working in. The campaign of 2012 was different than 08, and I suspect somewhat different than 16, different context. At colleges and universities, our world's evolving too. If you recall, last year or a year before, I showed you some of the graphs showing, we've had some run up in tuition in higher ed over time, and we've seen state support go down like this. That education is increasingly becoming a private good. If you want it, buy it, pay for it yourself. It is not a social good that our states are going to pay for at the level they did decades and decades ago. So when you see these changes going on in the world where a place like IU operates, and you see all the people, small politics, as you said, and the technology changing. I think the lesson that I saw in reading, when the nerds go marching in, was really that story of the whole of how you put it together. And I thought it was remarkable, and I'd like for you to speak a little bit about bringing in the brains that you did from Silicon Valley, the tech folks, and embedding them in a political operation where you had the political pros who generally knew how to do this stuff, at least self-perceived. What was that like leading the tech guys and girls?
I was going to say there's two things there. One is that, sadly, tech guys excludes 50% of the population. So we have to make sure that we're not saying that. But I think there's a couple important points there. One, it's amazing where you can source people from. Oftentimes, if you have a really cool thing you're doing or something that's really interesting, it's easy to find people. There's a startup in Iowa called Dwolla. Has anyone heard of Dwolla? It's a neat startup, does neat money stuff, finance stuff. But Dwolla, the CEO of Dwolla, this guy named Ben, tweeted this great tweet. And it was during this time when there was a big conversation about there wasn't enough talent. There wasn't enough people to do the jobs that we had. And he said, actually, it's not a talent problem. It's an interesting problem. There's not enough interesting problems. And I think about this a lot. When you look at your job postings, when your job posting is like Java Engineer 4, that's not very inspirational. But if your job posting is like, oh my gosh, you're going to save the world or whatever, and you talk about all these great things that you're doing because you're doing great things, all these things that are going to impact your community because you really are impacting your community. When you talk about the end instead of the day-to-day, when you talk about why instead of the kind of how you're going to get up and go to work, I think about this in like, what do you think to yourself when you get up? Because when you get up, you're basically sacrificing spending time with your family, with your friends, doing the things that you want to do with this other thing, which is work. And so when I get up right now, I think, okay, I'm going to the buy button mines, going to build things at PayPal. That's not very inspiring. You want it to be like, I am up and ready to go, let's do it. And that's actually hard because one of the hard things is I'm betting many of you are on the other side where you're not inspired. And so it's hard to inspire others when you're not. And so that's tricky, but it takes a little bit of a mind shift. It takes working together to find what that inspirational thing is. It takes remembering, especially, I think y'all are in a really good position where you're actually helping people achieve something else. You're helping them get to a level that either you're at or that their parents weren't at. You're helping them get to this place that they have that's hopeful, it's aspirational. That's really important. That's something you can sell. And
it is, and I'll say as somebody who attends a lot of graduations on our varied campuses, you just can't sit through graduation at IU without a tear in your eye. At some point, somebody walking across that stage, particularly for IU Northwest, Gary, a lot of first-generation college graduates, and it does connect to mission about what we're doing here.
And so how do you find people is a big question. It's not just about the job description. It's not just about inspiration. There's a bunch of things, actually. I'll try and keep it to two. The first one is we have this notion that Silicon Valley is the only place to hire people from. I actually think that's false. I think that that's probably the worst thing that we could do for our organizations is go hire people from California. First of all, Californians are weird. The second, I think there's just too much sun, not enough winter. Just strange. They don't know what coats are. It's weird. I don't understand it. But the second thing is that it's not a good dialogue. This is not a good narrative. Basically, when you're saying, we're going to go hire people from California, we're saying, you guys aren't smart enough. Let me go get the people who are. That's not nice. That's not good. The other thing that it doesn't acknowledge is that you probably have great, amazing people in the community or nearby who could do just as good of job. And so I like to think, how do we get those people first? And you have to acknowledge California does have a lot of good talent, a lot of technologists, a lot of people who've done some really great things. But there's probably a lot of people who grew up here, who want to move back here, who would want to come and have this lifestyle, not that lifestyle, especially when you're paying $4,000 a month for a studio apartment. I'm sure that's not, is it that expensive here?
$4,000 a month goes a long way in Bloomington. So let me hit quickly through a few questions that folks have asked. So what if the data gives us an answer that people don't want to hear? How can we help people embrace the answers?
That's a really hard question. And I think it actually goes to do more with how do we have a culture of data? How do we talk about data more? Because if the first time someone is interacting with data, it's something that they disagree with, especially by their, their heart, it's going to be a really hard relationship with data then on. And so I think this is about being very open about data, making it so everyone has this opportunity to say, let's look at the data. Once again, it goes back to that asymmetrical relationship. If we, the technologists, are the only one that have data and are the only ones that can say, well, the data says this, and we're not transparent about that data, the people are not going to get to that same decision. This happens all the time. I remember, when I was selling this company to PayPal, we came to this conclusion. We looked at all the data. We crunched the numbers. There was this very simple answer for how to best make sure our investors got their money back and a little extra. And so we sent the answer to everyone, and they were all like, I trust you, but I need to look. And so you think about that Reagan quote, right? Most of my quotations, for whatever reason, are from Republicans, which is very confusing for me personally. But the Reagan quote where he says, trust but verify. And that's a lot of what data is about. It's like, you have this conversation. I trust you as my coworker to present a good story about data, but I need to verify this myself. And so this is why I think providing open access to tools, open access to data, making it so we can all get to the same place. Sometimes the data doesn't tell you what you want to hear. And that's actually a really hard thing. It doesn't matter how transparent you are. You just kind of sometimes have to say, and sometimes it's okay to be like, that data's wrong. Just kind of say, even though this is what it says, my gut says something else. And that's, I don't know what the percentage there is. Is it 80-20? Is it 50-50? But sometimes you just got to go with your gut. And I think that's what, we're not robots, we're humans. And that's one of the benefits of being a human, is that we have that gut feeling. Sometimes it's right, sometimes it's wrong. Just remember, don't be clever.
So you obviously get to interview a lot of, I won't say clever, talented people. How do you choose who to hire when you're interviewing?
I have a bad habit of not doing technical interviews. Because I think for the most part, technical interviews are more about the interviewer trying to show how smart they are than learning about how smart this person you're interviewing is. It's more like, why don't you do a whiteboard? Like, when has anyone ever programmed on a whiteboard? No one has ever done that in their life. Like, oh, let's go to the whiteboard and program. That's never happened. Yet that's oftentimes what we think about in our interview process. It's all about gotcha questions. It's all about this idea of why are manholes round? How many manholes are there in the world? It's like, I don't care how many, that's never came up during work. Why would we ever need to know that? How many gas stations are there? I don't care. That's just never been an issue for me when I'm programming computers. But with that said, you do need this idea. There's a couple things that we measure. We measure humility. We measure empathy. We measure these things that actually are really important for when you're working together. Because I don't actually, I care about how smart you are. We definitely make sure that we hire people who know how to program. But I'm actually more interested, do you want to learn more? Can you teach? So one of the things we do, we hire engineers who are programmers, mostly software developers. And so, for example, what we'll do is we'll have we'll force the person to program in a language they're not comfortable with. Because what this allows us to see is, are they willing to ask questions and learn? If they just drop the computer and are like, no, I can't do this, that's probably not someone that's going to survive in a dynamic, learning place. But if someone says, I've never done this, let's try. Most of the things that I've done professionally, I have never done before. You have to try. And so you want that kind of ability to try. And then the other thing is, you want to do the opposite. You want to actually see what it's like to program in a language that you, as the interviewer, doesn't know, which is oftentimes something we're not comfortable with, because you want to know how they teach you. How are they going to teach their coworkers? When they sit there and they're like, I know how to do this, but you don't, are they going to be an asshole? Are they going to be nice? Are they going to wait for you? Are they going to help you through this? Especially when we think about technology as a disparity of information between the consumer and the creator, you want someone that has a lot of empathy. We also do a lot to try and ensure that we have a diverse workplace, making sure that code reviews and whatnot are blind. There's obviously lots and lots of studies about what happens when you don't have blind interviews or blind screenings, that you often only hire men. And that's not what we're trying to do. You can't build a product for the internet or a product for your users when the people who are building it only look like a small percentage of the people who are using it. And so we do a lot to try and ensure that, and then we do a whole lot, maybe more, to make sure that our workplace is comfortable for everyone, not just for white dudes. because technology needs more people, not just white dudes. Sorry, white dudes.
Definitely so. So one last question, then we'll wrap it up. You've had a lot of opportunity to come in and work on developing new software, new user experiences, reinventing industries. A lot of us have to work on things that have been around for quite some time.
There might be a reason for that, actually. It's harder.
Exactly. It's harder. So any advice for how to lead innovation from within when it's not a brand new market or a brand new clean design and you've really got to keep the thing rolling while you're trying to make it better?
I believe really heavily in APIs. I think that one thing that we've been able to kind of, I bet my career on many times is how do you build an API that allows us to kind of decouple the interface or how the user is using this product with how we're interfacing it as technologists. And so in 2008, it was all, every time you used a product, you're using that product exactly. But in 2012, we tried to have this kind of abstraction layer. So if it didn't work, we could iterate really quickly. I think that's something that's really important to think about is how do you create those abstraction layers? There's a really good example of this, Rackspace, which was a hosting company that used to be really cool. I still like Rackspace, that's a good company. But they had this thing where they bought a company called SliceHost, and SliceHost had all these APIs to automate building servers, cloud servers. But one thing they did that I thought was genius is they made an API that interacted with their ticketing system. The API was the same as the cloud servers. So when you needed to rack a server in the data center, you used this API. You didn't know on the back end that maybe it sent a fax to the requisition department and all this kind of legacy stuff. It just was slower. And so the idea was you can still wrap technology around legacy processes. You can have technology that sends postal mail. You can do all this stuff. You can follow the processes that we've built 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but you can make the interface modern. And it's all about that modern interface. And then I think the most important thing, probably the biggest bang for the buck, is just making sure it works well on a mobile phone or a mobile computer. And probably that is because, I don't know if you guys have talked to young people, but they literally don't know how to use not mobile phones. That's the only thing that they use. And it's so fascinating for me. I remember when I bought my first computer and my 345 megabyte Maxtor hard drive. And this was, of course I thought I will never need another hard drive. But that experience doesn't happen anymore. People come with phones that they've had a phone like, my friend's 5-year-old has a phone. It's not, it's not live on a network, but she has a phone, she watches Netflix, she plays some games. She will have that, her generation will have always had these phones. And so when we're thinking, this works on my computer, it's fine, that's wrong. It has to, does it work on my phone? Because every single person you hire from now on will expect it to work. And if it doesn't work, they're going to be like, this is crappy. It may be crappy, it may not. It may just not work on this small thing. And it's actually, you can get a long ways with responsive web design. And that's where I would spend most of my money, is just that. And the reason is because, who here doesn't have a smartphone? Okay, I guess we could ask this question. Who has a BlackBerry?
Me.
Okay, see, there you go. You really have a BlackBerry?
Android-based.
Okay, yeah. Keep telling yourself that. Is that big one?
No.
Okay, yeah. We'll talk later.
So mobile first has clearly been something for quite some time, but I'm thinking now that I don't even really want to have to deal with my phone. It needs to be Amazon Echo based. So I could just turn around and say, Alexa, drop my class, please. Which one? Philosophy. Your class has been dropped. Harper, thank you.
Thank you.